Hi folks, Andy here, and welcome to the very first book in a series of rankings about the British horror author James Herbert. 23 full-length novels to get through, so 23 videos in this series. As usual, this is just a personal opinion. These rankings are based on my enjoyment of these stories. They're not a definitive ranking by any means, nor do I pretend that my opinion is superior to anybody else's. If you are new to James Herbert, hopefully over the course of my ranking you will discover books that you too can enjoy. And my ranking is simply a list of worst to best that I think from what James Herbert has produced. If you know the works of James Herbert, it might be an alternative viewpoint to your own. I'm not going to pretend that my opinions are superior. I just want you to understand the reasons why I believe what I believe, and this is my my rankings. With that out of the way, I'm going to start off at number 23 with a book that I really wish I didn't have to talk about, because it's never pleasant to talk about any. It's never pleasant when you start a ranking system talking about the worst book and having to mention its flaws, but especially when that worst book happens to be the last book that author ever wrote. In James Herbert's case, we're starting off at number 23 with his 2012 novel Ash, which I genuinely do believe is his very worst book, and by some considerable margin. This was pretty hard to get through. First and foremost because it was the last book that Herbert wrote, and I read this after he died. He died very shortly after this book was released. As far as I'm aware, the details of his death were kept private. He wasn't listed as being ill, although it's a possibility he was, due to the fact that this book is quite controversial, and I'll get onto that in a little while. But yeah, this being Herbert's last ever book, I really would have liked his last book to be remembered as something good, and I'm sure that there are people out there who will enjoy this, but for me it's a book with a lot of unfortunate problems. I mentioned about Herbert being dying suddenly after release of this book, and although he wasn't listed as being suffering from a long-term illness, the fact that this book is quite controversial and that it touches on a lot of political subplots and conspiracy theories effectively mean that I think had Herbert survived to see a few years after the publication of this book, it might have been something that could have been seen as scandalous or libelous. I don't know. That's just my opinion, but it is a book in which I believe that he probably was ill, and he knew he was ill, and he knew that this was his last book. And I don't mean that to offend anybody in the Herbert household, but I don't believe that he had plans to continue writing after this. I think he wrote this book knowing that it was going to be the end. But that's just my theory based on content here. If I'm wrong, I'm happy to be proven otherwise. So this is based on the character of David Ash. I'm just going to move back a bit here, it's a bit uncomfortable. So the character of David Ash is a parapsychologist, paranormal investigator, featured in both 1988's Haunted and 1994's The Ghost of Sleeth. Two of, in my opinion, Herbert's very best books. A great character. And here we're presented with this character at a later point in his life where he's suffering from an unfortunate drink addiction, as well as receiving counselling for the events he's gone through, the aforementioned two books. And he's tasked with investigating a castle in Scotland, which is believed haunted. And he has 3 days to prove whether it is or isn't. Which sounds initially fairly par for the course. But the first major issue I have with this book is that fundamentally this is not a haunted castle story. The actual haunting aspect of it and its investigation only takes up a very small portion of the actual book. The vast majority of this is about conspiracies, about hidden identities, about effectively a bunch of famous people who have vanished from society for one reason or other, who are all living in this castle for reasons that are explained in this book. I won't spoil major events here, but you've got anyone from Robert Maxwell to the offspring of Princess Diana living in this castle. And if that sounds a bit strange, then it really is. The whole concept of what this book is about is just bizarre. It really does feel like Herbert had a bunch of conspiracy theories about famous people and wanted to shoehorn them into a book, because he even suggests that a lot of this isn't fiction, a lot of this is real. Who knows what the answer is to that? But you've got this massively bizarre, bloated story of conspiracy and protected identity, and it, for the most part, was a absolute dreck to get through. It really was an incredibly slow-paced and quite tedious read for a lot of it. Not least of which is the absolute obsession with pharmaceutical and prescribed drugs. There's so many in this book referenced by their technical name and what they do, and it's honestly, it's just infuriating after a while, just reading that many names of that many different types of drug that are prescribed in this castle for its residents. And it became, again, tedious. It's almost like he's trying to fill up word count by writing as many drug names as he could. It doesn't affect the story in any way, shape or form. Didn't need to be there. I think, irrespective of all of that, though, major issues I've got here is this is a story that sets itself as, like a ghost story. Starts off with a bizarre scene that is later referenced, but doesn't do a good way of segueing into the main story. And you've got about 100 pages of this book until we actually arrive at this castle. Now, Haunted, which came out in 1988, which is, again, a book I'll list on this ranking very highly, ran to about 230 odd pages in total. So at that point, we'd got halfway through the book. Here, 100 pages in, and nothing has actually happened. We've got a bit of world building, but its pace is incredibly languid and very, very just, it's a dreck to get through. It really is. It just so slow. The book itself was Herbert's longest book, almost 700 pages long. Absolutely did not need to be this long. The ending just goes on forever and ever and ever, and there's so little actual story here. You've got a whole bunch of side stories. There's one involving an assassin who's planning on bringing this place down, and like I say, we've got hidden identities and a bunch of other stuff that I don't want to spoil, but it's got all this stuff going on. A lot of it has no relation to the main story of investigation. And a minor spoiler I will say is once you do discover the source of the haunting and what's actually going on, and we even reference the offspring of Adolf Hitler here, it gets into really bizarre political territory. We're left with a ghost story which doesn't have any resolution, because the main ghost behind all this just vanishes from the story entirely, never to be seen again or referenced again. What their point was, why they're doing what they're doing, why they're doing it, when they're doing it, no idea. Never referenced. No explanation whatsoever. This book came 6 years after Herbert's last book, Secret of Crinkly Hall, which is also a ghost book. And it's a bit weird that he's trying to repeat himself with another ghost book. And I know that he took a very long time to write it. And Herbert's main ethos with writing was always just write something and then revise it later. And I just don't think he got the time to revise this. In fact, a lot of this doesn't even feel like Herbert wrote it. It feels like somebody else, a third party, has filled in the blanks. Because it's just such a long, slow, dull book about very little, other than bizarre conspiracy theories and hidden identities within this castle. A lot of it doesn't make sense. Its ghost aspect, like I say, doesn't have a reason and vanishes entirely. The ending, there's a bit in the ending involving a certain character that drowns. A minor spoiler, but yeah, it just, when they tried, the whole point of the story is to keep them alive, was just head-slappingly bizarre. I just thought it was awful in terms of how that was interjected, as was the whole thing with these spiders at the end, which just seemed to be thrown in from another book entirely. I just thought it was really, really bizarre. It's just a bizarre hodgepodge of ideas thrown together. Far too long, far too slow, really tedious to read. There are two things about the book I'd recommend. The first is that there's a sequence involving I think it's an afternoon or evening meal. It's only a short sequence in the book, but it reminded me of Herbert of the 70s, where he threw in a really graphic, stomach-churning scene, and it was great to see. The only scene of what I would describe as horror in the whole book, but a really good scene. That's quite early on. The other scene is my favourite, involves a chase where we've got Ash and his female love interest escaping from these wild cats, which is a very long-winded, protracted chase scene that just got better and better, and it was just a really good bit of atmospheric, tense writing, and it was longer than I expected, and the stakes built. On the subject of that, and a closing note before, because I mean YouTube will only allow 15 minutes tops to these videos unless I bow to their demands. The character of David Ash here, despite the fact that he's got a drink issue and he's received counselling, he doesn't take 5 minutes before he falls in love with his main female love interest, who also conveniently falls in love with him. No spoilers for the previous books, but if you've read either or both of them, you'd understand at this point, I think a relationship is the last thing that David Ash would actually ever undertake. He'd have zero interest ever again in his entire life in looking for love. Let's say that. I'll leave it at that. If you've read those books, you'll understand why. Yeah, it felt almost like somebody else writing who they thought Ash should be and not who Ash would have been. Even his boss seems to have romantic feelings for him, yet doesn't stop to sleep with the first person literally that comes across the office. Somebody she doesn't like, but to get information, she's quite happy to sell herself. It's strange, it really is. So in wrapping up, didn't want this to be last because it was the last book he wrote. It's his biggest novel, and it does have a couple of effective scenes. There isn't a single Herbert book out there that I would consider worthless. But 90% of this, if not 95% of this, is incredibly slow, dull, boring, silly, and a bit pointless. And easily my least favourite book that he wrote, with just page after page of stuff that I could have done without. A really sad way to end your career, and certainly in my opinion, the very worst book that James Herbert's ever wrote. So that's Ash in at number 23.